right, good evening to each one of you. We're glad to have each one present for our Wednesday night Bible study. And we are continuing our study on Wednesday evenings of Old Testament history, now particularly focusing on the life of King David as we move into 2 Samuel. And these narratives or accounts are good for us to study because, number one, they come from the Bible, and so these are inspired accounts. We learn from the lives of these men and women that we study. And one thing I notice when I study the Bible, and particularly as I examine characters that are mentioned in the Bible, I see how so much in life, when it comes to people's character and ways, has not really changed. And so while today we have a whole lot of progress that we see in areas such as science, in medicine, astronomy, things that have changed significantly just over the past century, the nature of man is still very much the same. And I've said this before, and you've heard me say it from the pulpit numerous times, that the Bible is a book that is relevant for all people in any age. And so, even at this moment, regardless of the facts that there are some 7 billion people on earth, and all these people are immersed in their own cultures and speak different languages, the Bible is still relevant to all these people and adaptable to any age. And the reason for that is the heart of man. The heart of man needs something. And every heart, and you know by that I don't mean the physical pump, but the heart of man, not just the mind, but his spiritual being, needs help. And we all need the same help, don't we? That's provided by the gospel of Christ. So when we study these Old Testament characters, for example, we see a man like Saul, who starts out with great promise, and leadership is given to him. And so today there are those who start out in life with great promise and quickly rise to leadership positions. But we also see that King Saul, he floundered. He became very disobedient to God. That affected his physical and mental, emotional, spiritual state. And then we have a man named David, who is a good young man, and a man who is identified in the Bible as one after God's own heart. And we see the free moral agency of man in all this, don't we? We know that Saul made decisions that were not in harmony with the will of God. And nothing is clearer than in 1 Samuel 15, when he refused to slaughter all of the Amalekites and destroy all their possessions, right? When he left that which was good, he made an excuse for it. We've saved the best of the sheep, for example, because we can sacrifice that. And so Samuel reminds him of something that's very important. To obey is always better than sacrifice. To obey is always better than trying to rationalize something in our own way of thinking. It goes back to what Brother Matt was talking about Sunday in his message from 1 Corinthians 1, and that is the foolishness of God, if there is such a thing, if you could say something like that. The wisdom of man is like foolishness with God. The wisdom of man is so far beneath that of God, it's his. If you could say anything about God's foolish and you can't, would still be wiser than men. All right? Now, I sometimes say something like this. If it appears that facts on the surface seem contradictory to what truth is, then you always go with truth, don't you? There are people who like to spout off their so-called facts. I remember hearing someone say on one occasion, we know that it would be better if two people just, man and woman, lived together before marriage, but we know we can't do that because that's not right. No, nothing that God ever says is right is bad for an individual. If God says it's right, it's good for you. If God says it's wrong, it's bad for you. So it's not true to say there are certain things over here that would be good for us, but we can't do them because God says it's wrong. No, you misunderstand the nature of God and His looking out for you and me and what's in our best interest. Well, we make serious mistakes when we do what Saul did. And that is, he himself admitted that he had played the fool, and he erred exceedingly. And innocent people were also hurt because of Saul's actions. And when you have someone who behaves like Saul, who's in such a position of power, it's going to have a negative impact upon whom? The children. And Jonathan is a great man, and yet he loses his life in service to his dad. Now, I believe through the study of the Scriptures, you can have a good idea of where Jonathan will spend eternity, and also Saul. All right? Jonathan was a friend of David, who was a friend of God. And Saul departed from the living God, and we have the account of his death, along with the death of Jonathan, in 1 Samuel 31. Now, it's interesting to me that in chapter 1, we are going to see something that may seem contradictory to the character of a good man. What I want us to see tonight in chapter 1 is how sensitive was the heart of David to the heart of God. What may be strange to the world about our behavior is right with God. And so you've got to remember that there are certain people in our world who claim that this is the moral thing to do when it may not be. Morality can really only be determined by what God has said, what God's judgments are. And so in this particular account, we have the follow-up to Saul's passing. And we learn that there is a man who comes from the Amalekites. Most of them have been slaughtered, haven't they? But he survives. And when he comes to David, he comes with a message that is urgent. And he comes, according to verse 2, and falls upon the earth and does obeisance, or he worships David. He's bowing down before him. He's showing homage to him. And he says to David, I have come from the camp of Israel, and I have escaped. Now, is it known by now throughout the realm that David is going to be king? Many people know this already. The word is already spread. David is a powerful man. If you had reporting done in that particular day, and it was honest, which that's honest reporting is somewhat of a misnomer these days, right? An oxymoron, something like that. There's no such thing. But if you had some honest reporting and you're watching the news and there are reports going, King Saul is still after David, all right? And the hearts of the people are falling in love with David. And it's widely expected that when Saul is no more going to be the king, that it will come down to either one of the sons of Saul or it will be David. And so, here is somebody who has a good idea that David will one day be the king, and that time is now because Saul is dead. Now, this man has something in mind. He's thinking, I want to make sure that I get in good with this fella named David. Now, will there always be people who position themselves so that they can be by those who win, who have power? We've just come out of a national election. Think about this. And these things seem to be ongoing all the time, don't they? We finish one and then already, right here a week before Inauguration Day, believe me, there are already men, women, thinking what? 2020 might be my year. For no other reason than this. I'd like to have some power. Okay, there are others who know, yes, that's right. And who might I align myself with so that I can get a position? All right? So let's say in 2 years from now you start having men and women of political prominence who start announcing, hey, I'm running for president in 2020. And so they're going to be political junkies and folks like that who start jumping on the bandwagon of a certain candidate. For what reason? I'm going to bet on this one, and who knows, he or she might just win, and think about what that'll do for me. All right? That's just how it is. And it could be that you're, in the end, your candidate flopped. Oh, well, I tried. Okay? Now, if possible, you'll check out who's still in the race, right? And you say, well, I'm going to join with this one. Because in the end, you'd like to have a nice position for yourself. Well, here is this fella who comes to David, who's going to be the next king, and he says, he's thinking, I'm betting on this guy David, and I've got some good news for him. Well, he really doesn't know David, does he? What we're about to see, we've seen played out before. David takes very seriously who God has anointed. It's not that David was so mesmerized by King Saul. He wasn't. This man was trying to seek his life, wasn't he? But there was something far more important to David. I cannot lift up my sword against King Saul because he's God's anointed. And God says, that's my man. He can't do that which might seem convenient. He's not going to do that which might seem right in his own eyes. He's not going to do that which will promote himself, because David says, I can't do this to God's anointed. And God honored him for that sensitive heart. So, here is a man who comes into the camp. Well, he comes out of the camp of Israel and he comes to David. And David just asks him, how did the battle go? Well, is David interested in battles? Is David interested in a war? Sure, he's a warrior. No doubt about that. And the men answered, the people are fled from battle, and many of the people are also fallen and dead. And then this news, Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. Now let's think about, let that resonate just for a moment. The toughest news that any of us can ever receive is that news when someone very, very close to us has died. Telephone rings. He's dead. No. Has this ever happened in your household? It happens in ours. One reason is because Celicia and I work with the congregation here. I'm a preacher. She's my wife. But I'm sure it's happened in your households, even though you may not be preacher and wife. But the phone will ring, and Celicia may answer the phone, and all of a sudden, and I'm like, I know something's happened. I don't know who it is. Something's happened. Maybe that I answer the phone. Something's happened. And she's got a look on her face like this isn't good. You know what I'm talking about. And then you tell each other and break the news. You won't believe this. Well, here is a man who comes to David and says, Saul and Jonathan are dead. My best friend. best friend. And that's how David gets this news. I wonder what his initial reaction might have been. I mean, in a split second. Could it have been that as soon as he heard this news, he didn't believe it? Who are you? What do you know about the ongoing battle? It could be that very quickly David went through the grief cycle, but like I say, just very quick. It's just like, who are you? What do you mean telling me something like this? Jonathan especially. Because you see, David will lament the death of Saul because it's the right thing to do. He'll lament the death of Saul, as we'll see in this chapter, because of God. He'll lament the death of Jonathan because of himself. And so David said to the young man, how do you know? How do you know that this has happened? How do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, be dead? Isn't that a question you might ask? How do you know this is true? You sure you got your information right? I don't believe it. But it's true. We've already read about it, haven't we? And so David said, how do you know this is true? The young man said, as I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called unto me, and I answered, here am I. Now understand now what's happening. He's getting ready to tell a story to David because he thinks this is going to be news that David is going to like. He does not know the heart of David, and he doesn't know the heart of God, doesn't he? He does not understand their relationship. If you want to test somebody in character, and I don't mean willfully and deliberately go out here and say, I'm going to test somebody, but I'm just saying, if this happens, you'll recognize something. If you have somebody come to you with information that's bad about somebody that's wronged you, that person likely thinks you might just take delight in it. I hope you don't. In fact, the Proverbs writer says that God sees when you rejoice when an enemy falls, and He doesn't like it. I have received news before of when somebody I considered an enemy had fallen. And when I got the news, I made myself fall to my knees. For what reason? I don't want to take delight in that. I don't want to gloat in that. Ha! He got what was coming to him, right? This fellow had to be thinking, can you imagine how quickly he must have been running to David? Oh, something great is about to happen for me. Now sometimes you can be rewarded when you have valuable information. Joseph had valuable information for Pharaoh, didn't he? And really God was behind everything that happened in the life of Joseph. It's a wonderful story of the providence of God. But David got an appointment with the Pharaoh and told him, here's what your dreams mean. Oh. This man says, you're going to be second in Egypt. You're going to be rewarded for saving my country. And he said, only in the throne will your power not be greater than mine. When you go out, people are to bow down to you. Your word is law. And so David was rewarded. David wasn't seeking the throne of Egypt either, was he? He just was doing right. I meant Joseph. And so as the young man that told him, as I happened upon by chance upon Mount Gilboa, here's what happened. Now, he said, Saul saw me, and he came to Saul. I'm here. What do you want? And he said unto me, who are you? And I answered him, I said, I'm an Amalekite. And he said, stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me. For anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. So he says, Saul has been injured. And Saul says to this man, take my life. You kill me. Is that what happened? No. Opposite page here in my Bible is 1 Samuel 30. This man didn't have anything to do with Saul's death. Saul took his own life. In fact, if you go back across the page there, you'll find that, but wouldn't do it. He had more honor, didn't he? No, that man was not going to. The one who was asked to do it wouldn't do it. Because he was at least like David in character, and he says, I'm not going to do that against the Lord's anointed. I won't do that. Sensitivity to God. It may seem like the right thing to do, but it's God's anointed. So Saul fell on his own spear. But the man continues. He said, I stood upon him and slew him because I was sure that he couldn't live after he was fallen. And I took the crown that was upon his head and the bracelet that was on his arm and have brought them unto you, my Lord. Can't you see the big smile on this guy's face? And so I don't want to paint a pitiful picture of this man because, number one, he was an Amalekite, he was self-seeking, and he presented a story that greatly misrepresented the truth. And since he did that, David could only take his word for it. He dug his own hole, didn't he? And so he says to David, I've brought these things to you. And David, the first thing that happens is he rent his clothes. And likewise all the men that were with him. Now that part, all the men that were with him, I think they're just following the example of David. I don't think they really are grieving over Saul as much as they're respecting their leader David. But David's tears are real. Why do you think his tears are real? For Saul, it's because this is God's anointed. That's number one. David did not want anything to appear as if God's reputation had been damaged. He was that much like Samuel, wasn't he? Remember, Samuel mourned over Saul. He was grieved till God said, would you quit mourning over Saul and move on? And so here we have David renting his clothes, everybody else that's with him doing the same. They mourned, they wept, and fasted until even for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. So there are a lot of emotions involved here, aren't they? This is a dark day. In Israel's history, this is likened to a 9/11 or December 7th, 1941, okay? It's that serious. It's that big. No. Now that's the other thing, what Becky just mentioned. Number one, I think David is mourning for Saul because he was God's anointed, and look what his death is doing to the entire nation. Number two is personal. He didn't start out that way, did he? It could be that David is so sensitive to God that he says, oh, I pity a man who died this way. And sometimes I think we need to be very, very careful. You know, the people that we as Christians don't really respect, that'd probably be a better way to put it than to say we don't like them. But whether they be celebrities, people like that who live so indifferently to God, and who are so anti-Christ and anti-Bible and anti-family, and then we hear, you know, that these individuals, you know, died young, or, you know, and you know, I mean, you see it on Facebook. We got what is coming to him, right? No pity. But really, that's not the Christian way, is it? Pity over the fact that someone died lost. All right? And so here is David, who's mourning for the people of Israel. It's a personal loss because of Jonathan. He thinks about Saul dying in his sins because he moved away from God. And so there are three facets to grieving here in verse 12. They mourned. That is, a state of grief has fallen over them. If you enter a place where a family visitation is taking place, whether it be in a church auditorium or if it's in a funeral home, there's an atmosphere there, right? It's not one we enjoy, but we have to do. I remember when I was a boy, there were some parents who would say they were not taking their children to a place like a funeral home. My parents said, "No, you're going, because death's part of life. And you need to learn how to accept that and how to comfort people." You ever heard Christians say, "I just can't go to the house of mourning, or there's a place where people have died, or I can't go to the hospital to see somebody so sick"? You have to. It's who you are. It's what Jesus did. Mourning, it's just an atmosphere of grief. I remember there was also a time, even I can remember this. Start telling my age here. I can remember this happening when I was just a boy, and then it pretty much disappeared in our society. Some of you are a little older than I am, and you remember it very, very well. And that is, you brought the deceased to where? The house, right? And I can remember as a boy, a family member, I can barely remember this figure who was like a great uncle maybe by marriage or something to maybe in my mother's family. And I can recall that, there were some other children there, and my parents saying, you just stay outside, you can play if you want to, or something like that. And I can remember that a daughter of this man had fainted, and she was brought out to the swing, and it was just an atmosphere that I knew, this isn't right. I don't like this. It's a house of what? Mourning.
Where you came and you sat with them all through the
Sat all through the night, yeah. All right, so what could be a jubilant place on a normal day wasn't on those occasions. Then weeping. Weeping is something what? That's outward expression of grief. Oh, I've been in the midst of speaking at a funeral service, and you had to pause because something would happen among one of the family members where the family member broke down, and we just had to pause till the person regained his or her composure or was allowed to go out or something like that. Mourning. So this is out loud. You can hear what's going on, the crying. And fasted. Can't eat. Just can't eat. Well, David said to this young man, now David now knows the news. They've rented their clothes and they're mourning. And now David says again, now who are you? I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. And David said, how were you not afraid to stretch forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And here's where we're going to have possibly a tough time if we don't see this from God's perspective and David's perspective. Remember, at this particular time, and God dealing with the physical nation Israel, and in covenant with them, David had an obligation before God to take care of this enemy. This is not a man who's pursuing righteousness. This is not a man who brought this news because he was a humble man and saddened at the death of Saul. He is a man who lied, saying, I did it. Aren't you proud of me? Because now you can have the throne. And so David said, were you not afraid to do this? Who had the opportunity, and it would seem the right, to kill Saul? David. David did. He's already proclaimed by God, anointed by Samuel, you're going to be the next king, but not yet. And therefore, David never took it upon himself to assassinate Saul. He never said to himself, oh, well, the Lord must mean now, or else he wouldn't have been delivered into my hand. He wouldn't do that. And he's trying to kill me. Yeah, so self-defense, right? Well, he's trying to kill me. I guess I can take his life. He would not do it. That's how seriously He considered matters that pertained to God. And this was his king, and he had anointed him. And hadn't David already said, I'll let God take care of him? Remember, we've already looked at the life of David and noticed how he didn't take revenge against somebody else. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I will repay. Who knew that better than anybody? David. And that shows extreme confidence that David has in following the will of God. David would say, I don't know how God's going to do it, but He will. He'll take care of Saul. Did God take care of Saul? Mount Gilboa, when he lost his life to the Philistines. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Very well could be, yeah. You know, this is not a man that could be trusted. So David called one of the young men, that's one of his men, one of his young warriors, and said, go near, fall upon him. And all the text says he smote him and he died. That seems harsh, doesn't it? And it was to that man who died. That was not it. And David said unto him, thy blood be upon thine head, for thy mouth hath testified against you, saying, I've slain the Lord's anointed. And so he told a lie, and look what happened to him. Well, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son in verse 17. We have the beginning of this dirge or this lament. And the whole poem, or maybe song, was a song of mourning and of grief being expressed, but it also was a song that lifted up the name of Saul and Jonathan. Now remember, Saul will be lifted up in David's psalm because he was God's anointed, not because he did him right. Jonathan because of their personal friendship. Now let me say this. Here we have one of the first expressions that I've seen in the Bible, and I probably need to do some more research in this area. I think I will. It caught my attention while I studied this. Don't you usually try to look at the best in another person once that person has died? We want to say something good. There are some out there that are notorious for their evil, and we mince no words about it. Hitler, for example, you know. We don't have any problem saying, you know, that was an evil man. Or we look back upon some of the Caesars, for example, the way they lived their lives. But most of the people that we know, even if we've had problems with them before, you know, had some problems getting along with them, once the person dies, well, you know, we start doing what? We start remembering the good things. And that's the way it ought to be. And I heard one of my mentors, whom I loved very much, who passed not too long ago, say this to another about a man who died who had really done him wrong. And yet, knowing this man like I did, and most of you knew him, I remember him saying, well, you know, he did do some good. Because that's the kind of man this was. I'm not going to speak ill of him in his death. I know he did some good. And I think that's what you find David doing here. Saul died, separated from God. That's sad enough, isn't it? These students ask me, what do you do, Brother Grider, when you preach a funeral of somebody who never became a Christian? And yet you've got to preach the funeral. Talk about the good they did. Or God wouldn't have chosen him. That's right. So if you're preaching Saul's funeral, there have been a lot of things you could have said negative about him. But I never will forget that in one of these classes when I was in school, it's one of the homiletics classes. I have the privilege of teaching this particular course now. But Brother McNutt was our teacher. And one young man who who had some, I believe, some emotional type problems. Very harsh fella. He didn't complete his studies in the School of Preaching, but we were doing various presentations, and this had to do with a lost man, with a man who had died and was lost. Brother McNutt says, all right, I want to hear one of you give a presentation. You know, how would you preach the sermon of someone lost? And I never will forget that this young man volunteered, and I mean, he was so harsh. He talked about the rich man and Lazarus from Luke 16. That's where this fellow is now. And he got about halfway through his speech, and he, I think, could tell that we were really bothered by the things he was saying. It just wasn't appropriate, and he said, I think maybe I ought to sit down. Well, Brother McNutt's getting on up in age, and he didn't really know this fellow well, and you remember how Brother McNutt had pretty much lost his voice by the time he reached 80. And Brother McNutt said, from the back of the room, he said, I believe if a man died lost, I'd just try to encourage his family. He said, he's already lost. There's nothing you can do about it, right? And I've tried to pass that along to our students. But here is a lamentation over Saul and over David. And it brings to my mind the story of a man who died, who was a known drunkard and gambler, and he cheated on his wife, and he was fraud and all that kind of thing. And when he died, a preacher had the task of preaching his funeral. Nobody liked the man. But his brother said, listen, you've got to preach my brother's funeral. You better say something about him that was good. And the preacher was stuck. He didn't know what he's going to do. But he got up at the funeral the next day to preach that man's funeral, and he said, we all know that this man was a drunkard, a fraud, a cheat. But he said, compared to his brother, he was a good man. Thank you all.